Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is January 30th, 2017, and boy, do we have a lot of things to talk about tonight. Specifically, the Donald Trump administration, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to try to get into the detail of what's been happening over the last week and what might be coming in the future. We'll also try to talk about some other domestic issues, and we're going to try to talk about the foreign policy issue as well. Also going to talk about solutions, and I think this is one of the important aspects of what we're going to do here is not only we've got a new administration doing new things, and we need to look at this not under the lens of certainly a party ideology. As a Republican president, therefore everything he does is bad. That insinuates that the Democrats are good, and we certainly know that they're not. We're not going to look at this as necessarily merely a ideological opposition, which is we made up our minds to hate Trump from the beginning, and now we're going to do that regardless. If he saves the lives of a million children, then we're still going to hate him. And this is not what we're going to do either. We're going to address the Trump administration through a criticism of principled demands. And again, these demands are those that are set forth in the 43 Points article that I did, which you can find on my website, A Real New Deal for America, 43 Points. And I'd encourage you to check that article out so you can understand what we are actually arguing for. So in the areas that Trump is working with us, we will support him in that effort. In the areas that he's working against us, we will fight him tooth and nail. And this is what I've said early on. This is what we're going to do. So if you're looking for rabid foregone conclusions, then you're not going to find it here on this show. There's a lot of people who've made up their minds that they've already lost the war, so they are going to report every battle as a loss. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think for some reason our alternative media and many activists who are sympathetic with our cause have been down so long they don't know what up looks like. And at the same time, I think many are overly optimistic and are willing to simply give their brains away to a cult of personality and go along with whatever that personality decides to do. And as a result, they're overly optimistic, and they've actually joined a personality cult and are out of the fight. So we're going to certainly avoid that. We're not into personality cults at all. So there will be no rabid defense of the Trump administration here on this show. But we're into realism, real analysis, and realistic and idealistic solutions and demands. Now, before we get into the details, I want to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. You can catch this show on rebroadcast on pretty much every night on UCY.tv, and the show's being broadcast at UCY, but it's being reposted at a number of different websites. And one of the websites, of course, is my own, BrandonTurbeville.com. So feel free to check it out there as well and share around the archive posts that usually come out on Tuesdays, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, but usually get it out around Tuesdays. If you want to keep track of my work, activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, arrowofwisdom.org, and my work specifically, I definitely encourage you to go to BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archives are there, and all that information is available to you. Now, assuming that there are no snags in what in what we're working on here. There are always the possibility of snags, but we're hoping that there won't be any. Tomorrow, January 31st, we will release a new book, Resisting the Empire, The Plan to Destroy Syria and How the Future of the World Depends on the Outcome. It is my new book. Again, it's called Resisting the Empire, The Plan to Destroy Syria and How the Future of the World Depends on the Outcome. And it will be available. It will be available on Amazon. It'll be available hopefully on Kindle the same day. And you'll be able to purchase the book. It's very fast shipping, and I'd encourage you to pick up a copy. The book is around 400 pages. It's very, very well done, if I say so myself. We had some professional help on this, and of course, Afra Dagher, the Syrian girl that I've done a number of interviews with. You will know her from our videos from the radio show and from her articles now. She's a writer and analyst on her own accord now, and she wrote the preface to the book, and it's an absolutely beautiful preface. There are 12 chapters where we'll discuss the Syrian crisis from beginning to end, right? We're talking about the moderate opposition, and we talk about fake humanitarian organizations, the ceasefire agreements, America's propaganda, and then we talk about how ISIS was made in the USA, and then of course we talk about who benefits. Chapter 7 goes back into the beginning of the crisis. We talk about Al-Qaeda being the CIA's Arab Legion, the nature of destabilization. We talk about Russia in World War III, and we talk about the inevitable end of the empire. And, of course, there's a chapter that is written upon my returning from the Middle East, which is just some personal stories about the people I met while being there. And, again, the book is about 400 pages, jam-packed full of information. And if you want a key to what's going on in Syria, then you can you need to purchase Resisting the Empire. It's going to be kept down to a reasonable price. It's going to be around $14.95, and I think that's a fair price for what you're getting. Again, this is about 400 pages of condensed, detailed information, all sourced, and it's had some professional work done to it. So I think this is the best book that I've written yet, and I encourage everybody to pick up a copy. It's going to be indispensable because as where we are right now in America, it's crazy town. Nobody really has any bearings because they don't have any principal demands. But the left has gone crazy, the right has gone crazy, the alternative media has gone crazy. Everybody is scattered about like chickens with their heads cut off, and this book is going to provide you with a detailed understanding of what's happening in Syria with no bullshit, none coming from the mainstream corporate media of the West, and no hysterics coming from the alternative press either. So I encourage you to pick it up. It'll be available on January 31st. It'll be available on Amazon. It'll be available on my website, and there'll be some deals available as well. Now, let's talk about the state of the country as where we are right now. Well, let's talk about what's so concerning here. Okay, let's first look at these interesting statements in relation to Syria. We had a few days in office. We had a mysterious drone strike in Yemen, and we don't know at this point. We still don't know what that drone actually struck. Did it strike civilians in Yemen, or did it strike Al-Qaeda? And there are very few reports. All we know is that there was a drone strike. And depending on what the drone actually struck, that's going to tell us a lot about the direction of the Trump administration and the way we think it's going to go. But many people now, we're wondering what the Trump policy towards Assad will be. And, of course, the Trump cabinet is incredibly frightening. His cabinet is made up of Zionists, anti-Iranian warmongers, and this is extremely frightening. But during the campaign, of course, Trump hinted around at a stronger relationship with Russia and a realization that Assad was not only the better option, but actually a major force for fighting terror. That was clearly a good sign, but when's the last time you could believe a politician on the stump? But a few days after he took office, it was still unclear. He didn't actually give a clear suggestion as to what he wanted to do in Syria. January 23rd, we had reports circulating in the Russian and American press suggesting that Russia and the U.S. had just completed their first joint airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. And one of the reports came from the Associated Press, and it was echoing what was being reported by much of the American media. This is what it says. It says, quote, "The Russian military says its warplanes have flown a joint mission in Syria against the Islamic State group together with the U.S.-led coalition. If confirmed by Washington, the mission would represent the first coordinated action against ISIS by Russia and the U.S.-led coalition. Russia has pushed for such cooperation in the past, but Barack Obama's administration had refused. New U.S. President Donald Trump has called for joint efforts with Russia against the Islamic State. The Russian Defense Ministry said its forces in Syria had received coordinates of ISIS targets near al-Bab on Sunday from the U.S. side via hotline with the International Coalition headquarters. It said Monday that 2 Russian warplanes and 2 aircraft of the U.S.-led coalition then struck the targets, destroying several ammunition and fuel depots along with militants and weapons. The attack followed a joint raid in the same area flown by Russian and Turkish jets on Saturday." Okay, end quote. We've also got RIA Novosti quoting the Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry, as saying, "After conducting reconnaissance, 2 Russian Air Force planes and 2 planes from the forces of the International Coalition delivered airstrikes on terrorist targets." The Defense Ministry did not post the announcement on their social media or official websites. That quote is coming from RIA Novosti. Within half an hour of that report, though, the United States military stated that the Russian claims of cooperation were rubbish. In fact, the update to the Associated Press article says, quote, U.S. Air Force Colonel John Dorian, a coalition spokesman, almost immediately labeled the Russian claims as propaganda. U.S. Navy Captain Jeff Davis, a Pentagon spokesman, said the U.S. does have routine deconfliction talks with Russia to avoid unintended aerial incidents in Syria's crowded skies. But Davis says there has been no changes to that arrangement, and the U.S. has insisted for months that it has no coordination or sharing of targets with Russia. So what does this mean? All right, what does this mean? Does it mean that the U.S. policy in Syria is the same as it was before Trump? Has Trump simply not gotten around to changing the policy? Despite it being a possible catalyst for World War III, does it mean that he hasn't gotten around to it yet? Does it mean that the mainstream press in both Russia and the United States had bad information? And still, at this point, January 30th, the show's being recorded on the 30th. On the 29th, rather. We still don't know. We had in the press conference, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, he appeared to open the door to collaboration. He says, quote, I think there's a way we can combat ISIS with any country, whether it's Russia or anyone else, and we have a shared national interest in that. And if we have a shared national interest in that, sure, we'll take it. He also hinted that Trump might already have ordered Defense Secretary James Mattis in what is to be the Trump administration policy towards Syria. So it's not likely that Trump simply hasn't gotten around to the question yet, because he hinted around that Mattis already knows, Mad Dog Mattis already knows the Trump policy, the marching orders. But what's more concerning is the fact that Spicer still hinted at the possibility that the United States is hostile to Bashar al-Assad. And when when he was asked whether or not there's the potential for cooperation with Assad in destroying ISIS, this is his response. We're not going to get together with people under the guise of defeating ISIS if that's not truly their guise. So let's not take that too far. What? Are we suggesting that Assad is not fighting ISIS? Sean Spicer. Trump has had a strange policy toward the Middle East, and one way being pragmatic and logical, and another being just irrational and aggressive. Remember, when he was asked about the war in Iraq, he said, if we kept the oil, you probably wouldn't have ISIS because that's where they make their money in the first place, so we should have kept the oil. And then he said, but okay, maybe you'll have another chance. So we don't, what does that mean? Right? The bizarre news story that is coming out of Russia now, and might merely be a blip on the radar, or it might be a signal of better things to come, but it also might be a signal that the American imperialism war machine is raging on. To suggest that Assad must go, or that the Assad government is not fighting terror, especially ISIS, is ludicrous. That such a suggestion now is the expression of an alliance with American war policy, as that policy has existed for the last 6 years under the previous administration. Only time will tell, I suppose. But the other question is, why would the Russian media report this as a joint military airstrike if it was rubbish? Doesn't quite make sense. So we're going to keep close tabs on this for sure, because it affects us all. But right now we're urging the Trump administration to immediately cease and desist funding radical jihadist groups that are including but not limited to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Free Syrian Army, any other group working under the moniker of moderate rebels. If you want to defeat ISIS, you don't need jet planes and ground troops to do it. All you need to do is grab a pen and order the CIA, order the Pentagon to stop funding these jihadist monkeys. So we're urging the administration to immediately begin talks with both Russia and Syria and establish positive relationships with both, and expressing a desire to step away from the current war footing of the U.S. And we would encourage Trump and his administration to provide both the Russians and Syrians with coordinates of terrorist groups that are funded and directed by the United States, so they can finally be eliminated once for all. Let Assad and Putin do the bombing. It's time for America to go home, catch a breath, stay there for a while, stay inside the American borders for a change, and just worry about defense of the U.S. population as opposed to imperialism. So that's what we're calling for. Now, let's look at yet another bizarre policy here. We want to talk about the safe zones and the possibility of safe zones in Syria under the Trump administration. So we have this executive order by Donald Trump regarding his plan to suspend the U.S. refugee program and tighten procedures for vetting people entering the country under refugee visa. But and we'll get to that in a minute. We'll discuss that in a minute. But we also have the potential for the creation of a safe zone buried within this executive order. And we have Julia Edwards-Ashley and Matt Spitalnik of Reuters summarizing the plan. They say, quote, President Donald Trump is expected to order the Pentagon and the State Department in coming days to craft a plan for setting up safe zones for refugees in Syria, according to a document seen by Reuters on Wednesday, a move that could risk escalation of U.S. military involvement in Syria's civil war. The draft executive order awaiting Trump's signature signaled the new administration may be preparing a step that his predecessor Barack Obama long resisted, fearing the potential for being pulled deeper into the bloody conflict and the threat of clashes between U.S. and Russian warplanes over Syria. The Secretary of State, and this is what the draft order is allegedly saying, the Secretary of State, in conjunction with the Secretary of Defense, is directed within 90 days of the date of this order to produce a plan to provide safe areas in Syria and in the surrounding region in which Syrian nationals displaced from their homeland can await firm settlement, such as the repatriation or potential third country resettlement. Now, this is what Spitalnik and Ashley say. Creation of safe zones, if Trump decides to do so, could ratchet up U.S. military involvement in Syria and mark a major departure from Obama's more cautious approach. Increased U.S. or allied air power would be required if Trump chooses to enforce no-fly restrictions, and ground forces might also be needed to protect civilians in those areas. Still, the document gave no details on what would constitute a safe zone, exactly where they might be set up, and who would defend them. Jordan, Turkey, and other neighboring countries already host millions of Syrian refugees. The Turkish government had long pressed Obama without success for creation of a no-fly zone in Syria on its border with Turkey. The draft raised the possibility of establishing those safe havens in neighboring countries, but did not elaborate. So that's the Reuters report. They are characterizing this move as part of a larger plan to restrict refugee influx into the U.S., especially from specific countries. In true Trump fashion, this document does not have details. It really doesn't. So it's possible that the order only revolves around the repatriation of refugees already inside the country. But given the coverage provided to the issue of safe zones and no-fly zones in Syria over the last few years, it's unlikely that the terminology would simply be used out of ignorance. Instead, we have the safe zones. We also have the possibility of the safe zones being established in neighboring countries. Well, then there is the possibility that those terms are being just blurred, but it's not likely that other countries are going to want any more refugees themselves. Remember, only Europe, Western Europe and the United States are expected to accept millions of refugees without question. Other countries are not. They're able to have better control over that. Now, it needs to be noted that the order is not an order to produce a safe zone. It's an order to produce a plan to create a safe zone. Now, that's a fine line, and it shows where you're going, but there is a difference. And it's entirely reasonable to begin scaling back America's open immigration policies and the influx of these questionable refugees, as well as sending them back to their home countries. But a safe zone in Syria is an entirely different ballgame. Safe zones, as we have known them over the last 6 years, plain and simple, are war. A safe zone has to be enforced, and how else can you enforce a safe zone but with ground troops and fighter jets? Even had General Carter Ham saying as much. This is his quote when he was talking about it. He says, "We should make no bones about it." He's talking about a no-fly zone. It first entails killing a lot of people and destroying the Syrian air defenses and those people who are manning those systems. And then it entails destroying the Syrian Air Force, preferably on the ground, in the air if necessary. This is a violent combat action that results in lots of casualties and increased risk to our own personnel. We had Philip Breedlove, another general, saying, "I know it sounds stark, but what I always tell people when they talk to me about a no-fly zone is, it's basically to start a war with that country because you're going to have to go in and kinetically take out the air defense capability." We had Senator Roger Wicker getting caught like a deer in the headlights by General Joe Dunford when he asked what it would take to impose a no-fly zone upon Syria. And the general responded, "Right now, for us to control all the airspace in Syria would require us to go to war against Syria and Russia." So, the establishment of a safe zone is not a new concept. July 2015, the agreement that was being discussed would have effectively created a buffer zone that would have spanned the Turkish borderline into Syria. It would have extended from Azaz in the east to Jarablus in the west, as far south as Al-Bab. And the width of the zone would have been about 68 miles and extended around 40 miles deep into Syria, right on the doorstep of Aleppo. That buffer zone was actually created with Turkey's Operation Euphrates Shield, and it has functioned as the last open NATO-protected supply line for ISIS and its allies to enter Syria from Turkey. Many people did hope that a Trump victory would finally mean the end of terrorism and destabilization in Syria, but after a week in office, we are showing signs that Trump is an establishment figure as time moves on, but he's also done a lot of things that are not establishment, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So if America wants to stop terrorism in Syria, it just needs to stop funding it. It needs to stop supporting it and directing it. It's that simple. The U.S. could call on its allies in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UK, France, Qatar, Israel to do the same. It could work with Russia to eliminate the remnants of terrorist forces, and it could provide information and coordinates to both Syria and Russia on the whereabouts of those terrorists and terrorist forces. And at this point, legitimate refugees would no longer have a reason to leave, and refugees taken in by the U.S. could be shuttled back to their home countries with no fear of them returning to war. A safe zone under the guise of repatriation of refugees is simply a safe zone under another name. With the argument under Obama, a safe zone was to protect civilians from ISIS and Assad. And here we might have a safe zone to repatriate refugees. But the American people and the Syrian people do not want further involvement by the United States in Syria. It's time to stop funding terrorists and rebels and end the American presence in Syria. So what I'm saying to you here in summary is that we don't fully know what this safe zone policy is. Is the safe zone actually a way to repatriate refugees to surrounding countries or to work with the Syrian government to repatriate them in Syria? Or is it just another no-fly zone policy under a different name? And time will tell, and I think we're going to be seeing in the coming weeks what this policy might be. Now, let's talk about one more thing involving the Middle East here. Candidate Trump was rather hard on the terrorist-financing Neanderthal government of Saudi Arabia, but President Trump does not seem to be taking as hard a line with the Saudis as many people thought he might. On January 23rd, the U.S. State Department announced the first arms sales of the Trump administration, and it is going to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, $1.85 billion worth of material being sold to these feudal monarchies. Approval of the arms deal does have to be approved by Congress before actually taking place, but nobody believes that those parasites won't sign off on it. I won't go into the Washington Post breakdown of what the sales actually are. We won't go into all of that, but this is despite the fact that the Saudis are launching a horrific war against Houthi rebels in Yemen, where the Saudi aerial bombing campaign has killed a staggering number of civilians and essentially destroyed most of the country. The Saudis have virtually reduced Yemen back to the Stone Age and created one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world, even rivaling the crisis in Syria. It may have actually even overtaken the crisis in Syria in terms of the humanitarian catastrophe. And the Saudis have also, of course, been instrumental in creating the Syrian crisis. So, to be clear, it appears that this arms sale is a holdover from an agreement under the Obama administration, which itself allowed for $40 billion in weapons transfers to take place. But it's still worth noting that while Trump routinely and rightly calls out Saudi Arabia for supporting terrorism and generally acting as a leech on the money and military of the United States, Trump's policy appears to be continuing to supply the sustenance of the Saudi ape royal family and the sustenance they need to survive. So we anxiously await the justifications for providing such a glaring contradiction in rhetoric versus policy from the Trump administration on this issue. Now, let's talk about something else. One of the first executive orders on Monday, January 23rd, Trump announced the prevention of withholding funds from non-governmental organizations who perform abortions from overseas. Right, so the ban had been originally in place during the Reagan administration, and then it goes through a series of back and forth whenever Republican and Democratic administrations assume the office. Republicans tend to implement the ban, Democrats tend to rescind it. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer says, the president, it's no secret, has made it very clear that he's a pro-life president. He wants to stand up for all Americans, including the unborn, and I think the reinstatement of this policy is not just something that echoes that value, but respects taxpayer funding as well. So, amid catcalls of the patriarchy coming from many pro-abortion commentators, Trump signed the order alongside a table full of men, apparently ignoring the constitutional amendment known only to feminists requiring a matriarchal presence on all official documents. I guess Lena Dunham has done a lot of research, and probably in coordination with Gloria Steinem, and we now realize that in our Constitution there's a little-known clause that says only women can make decisions on abortion. So anytime that there's a decision to be made, there must be at least 3/5 feminine presence on the board. There is no, of course, explanation about gender fluid people. I think we need to get on that immediately. Of course, I'm being sarcastic because all that is bullshit. But pro-abortion activists, NGOs, especially those focused on abortion and sterilization, which is really what they're there for, and much of the mainstream press of the leftist variety are absolutely incensed by Trump's decision. Now, to be clear, government funds did not go directly to fund abortions. They were given to organizations for other services, but that freed up money for abortions to be conducted. Many of these charities, and I use that term lightly, and NGOs are now howling that the new policy is going to prevent women from receiving health care and contraception and lead to a holocaust of unsafe abortions, unwanted children, and presumably overpopulation. We have CNN, the fake news network. Trump's decision was labeled as catastrophic, leading to women in developing countries paying the price, or according to Marie Stopes International's vice president and director of the organization's international operations, Marjorie Newman Williams. According to the charity, the loss of its services during Trump's first term could cause 6.5 million unintended pregnancies, 2.2 million abortions, 2.1 million unsafe abortions, and 21,700 maternal deaths. So wait, preventing abortion is going to cause 2.2 million abortions? Actually, I thought you guys wanted the abortion, so why are you using that as a negative in your statistics? But whatever. The organization also said it will also be prevented from reaching 1.5 million women with contraception every year. All the medical advice, as well as everything we know from our daily interactions with women, is unequivocal. If you take safe abortion services out of the reproductive health care package, it exposes women to risk, Newman Williams said. Attempts to stop abortion through restrictive laws or by withholding family planning aid will never work because they do not eliminate women's need for abortion, added Newman Williams. This policy only exacerbates the already significant challenge of ensuring that people in the developing world who want to time and space their children can obtain the contraception they need to do so. Of course, none of these organizations, despite all their hysteria at not being able to continue killing children, even consider the fact that they could cease the practice of killing children in order to continue providing other life-saving services to underserved women in the third world, including contraception. So it's clear the organizations are willing to sacrifice women's health for the cause of abortion. So we know clearly where they stand and what's most important to them. We have CNN quoting Marie Stopes International also said that it gave 2,843 general and gynecological checkups and performed 586 contraceptive implant insertions in the wake of the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, all supported by U.S. funding. So we have an earthquake and they run into need to do abortions, I guess. But so here's the question: what is stopping Marie Stopes from continuing to provide gynecological checkups or contraceptive implants or whatever else? What's preventing them from doing that? Well, the only thing preventing them is the organization's insistence on continuing the practice of abortion in the name of women's health. We even have Nancy Northrup, president and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights, pro-abortion organization. And she's laughable. She says Trump's global gag rule will only lead to increases in unintended pregnancies, unsafe abortions, maternal and newborn deaths, end quote. Only lead to increases in unintended pregnancies? You mean only lead to increases in children being born from unintended pregnancies? And also, the policy of not funding abortion will lead to more newborn deaths? Really? On what planet? That's more children will die if we don't kill them earlier is essentially what she's suggesting, right? So I guess deer hunters now need to go out and lobby for a lift on kill caps so the deer don't die on the highway. I guess this is the logic. And again, this is the logic coming from these organizations, and of course to the people who support them and who are radical abortionists. That makes total sense because they don't really base their ideology on logic at all. It's complete emotion. We have Gersh Kuntzman of the New York Daily News, an appropriate name, I guess. And then he's even taken to the nonsensical statement that the Trump's new policy will not decrease the number of abortions, but in fact increase them. So not funding abortions is going to increase abortions, according to Gersh Kuntzman. He has a study from the World Health Organization that was conducted in a clear conflict of interest with the pro-abortion Guttmacher Institute. And even then, when you look at the study, which I did, the results suggest that the rates of abortion didn't change regardless of whether the ban was in effect or not. But if you look at the study, it shows abortions going up. It doesn't show them clearly linked with a ban or not. This is similar to the vaccine studies that show vaccines preventing polio, when actually it shows, if you look at the full studies, the polio was going down to begin with, and this is what you see, that the abortions were going up. So the study only shows that abortion rates are going up, not that there's a correlation, but what about banning abortion suddenly makes women want to go get one in such large numbers? I guess it couldn't have nothing to do with the legions of NGOs and philanthropic organizations propagandizing people in the third world for years and years and years on end that abortions equal freedom, and then spending millions of dollars to provide those abortions for free. His logic is skewed. He's suggesting that the U.S. government should fund the killing of children in order to prevent the killing of more children. And if he's such a fan of abortion, if it goes up, what's his problem, right? Whether the numbers go up or down, we have to commend Donald Trump for this. This decision removes the blood of millions of children off the hands of Americans, at least those who aren't drooling at the possibility of free and open abortions. We commend Trump on this decision and hope the United States begins to move further toward a culture of life and away from the culture of death it has embraced for so long. And now we encourage him to move toward eventually looking at defunding organizations here in the U.S. that are providing abortions inside America's borders. So let's look at some other issues. We need to talk about his pipeline fiasco, and we also need to talk about the issue of tariffs. And I think that's the one I want to get on first because there's a lot to say on this, and this is actually an issue that there's much confusion on, and this is going to anger probably the left-wingers who would oppose the second coming of Christ if he had a Republican, had an R in front of his name. Of course, the second coming of Christ would not have an R in front of his name, but you get the idea. And it's going to anger, of course, the alternative media. A lot of the alternative media are having a fit and throwing a tantrum over the possibility of tariffs. Well, why is that? Well, partially it's because they don't have a clue about economics, because most of them are libertarians or anarchists. And unfortunately, they don't understand economics. And we are not going to take part in a race to pre-civilization until we're all digging in the dirt and living a tribal lifestyle and hunting wild animals for our meals every day. That might be romanticized in the anarchist mind of someone who really doesn't want to do much. But this is not what we're looking for. We're looking for scientific development and progress in the living standards of the world. We're not looking to devolve back to a period of time that we've already been in. But we had midweek Donald Trump announcing his intention to create a border wall with Mexico, and obviously making good on that campaign rhetoric to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. And nobody really believed that Trump would actually make Mexico pay for it, but it looks like he's going to do just that. And that's as a result of his 20% protective tariff on all goods coming in from Mexico. Now, I want to say clearly, I don't have... I'm not a fan of border walls, simply because border walls can keep us in as much as they keep other things out. But the illegal immigration problem in the United States is absolutely out of control, and something has to be done with it. So I've always been in favor of increasing Border Patrol agents. They don't need to be 500 miles they don't need to be in Montana. They need to be on the borders. They're Border Patrol agents. They need to be on every inch of the border, and if we have to put the National Guard down there, we can put the National Guard down there. But illegal immigrants have to stop coming over, period. But that aside, we need to talk about the tariffs, right? So the tariff hasn't been set in stone, but the mainstream and alternative media are now on fire with debates surrounding protective tariffs and protectionism. And of course, the hysteria over tariffs coming from the mainstream and alternative media outlets is just the manifestation of propaganda of globalization and free trade that's been drilled into the heads of the American people for years by government and international corporations at Wall Street and the mainstream media as a host of questionable think tanks and organizations, so they'll accept lower living standards, lower wages, and the domination of society by corporate oligarchs. The truth is that America desperately needs a shift away from globalization and free trade in favor of protectionism and a real national economy based on high wages, high skills, and production. The hysteria from both the alternative and mainstream media is greatly misplaced and based on misinformation. So any outlet that you read telling you that protective tariffs are bad, you should ignore their economic advice. They don't know what they're talking about. And I say that point blank, without exception. I'm not saying they're not good on other things, but in terms of economics, they don't know what they're talking about, and you should back away from them on that. The anti-tariff argument, let's take a look at that. It generally goes something like this. If the U.S. imposes a tariff on imports coming from Mexico, then the companies that are making those products are going to have to raise the prices of the goods they're selling inside the United States to pay for the tariff. And this is what the opponents argue is actually a form of taxation on the American people, since they're going to have to pay for more goods shipped from Mexico. Most of the individuals arguing against the Mexico tariff oppose all tariffs, and they suggest that protectionism and tariffs are dangerous to economies, and they have a history of being so. But this isn't an argument against the new tariff. It's an ideology, and that's one that's been promoted by finance oligarchs for a long time, particularly over the last 40 years. And if you even go back to the 1500s, the question of establishing a world hegemonic order based on free trade was discussed at the highest level of British aristocracy. John Dees actually talked about the creation of a British empire based on free trade. And if you look at the British Corn Laws, for instance, go back to the British Corn Laws. We'll talk about that in a minute, but we'll come back. I think the most important thing is that you can look around the world today and see the results of free trade and globalization. The Western world, which was once the standard bearer for living standards and labor standards and quality of life, is now a shell of its former self. It's increasing unemployment numbers that are the highest since the Great Depression, low wages all around, increasingly poor working conditions, the general decline in the standard of living. The third world has absorbed these jobs, but they fill their employment roles with slave labor and virtual slave labor and bare subsistence living. In fact, living standards are no better than they were before, and in many cases they're worse due to the fact that people are now worked to death as well as being subject to the pollution of the companies that have sought out their country because they have a lack of regulation. Now, we have an example of economics based on low or no tariffs, and if tariff opponents are suggesting that free trade and globalization are the way to go, they need to be laughed out of the building. 40 years of their economic strategy has turned a country of high wages and the biggest middle class in world history into a nation of unemployed, struggling workers competing for minimum wage jobs and all around amid a collapsing infrastructure. The lower living standards countrywide, poor health, a food supply that scarcely actually resembles food. In other words, anti-tariff activists have their own results readily available for all to see, readily available to disprove anything they have to say. If you don't like tariffs, take a look around and look at the handiwork of your economic policy. You have broken this country with your absolutely insane ideology. It's time to shut up and let the adults take over. Now, tariffs throughout history have generally been positive and beneficial to national economies, going all the way back to the English Corn Laws. And only in instances where there was an internal trade war, prior to our Civil War, for instance, or a tariff was imposed ridiculously, like against a tariff imposed on a good that you couldn't actually produce here, for instance, that is when it becomes a problem. But that's just stupidity. The English Corn Laws, I mean, when I kept referring to those, that was a tariff on corn into England, and at one point the English Corn Laws, the tariffs, were removed. And what happened when the Corn Laws were removed, corn got dumped into England, and all of the farmers, they couldn't keep up because the prices of the corn coming in was so low. The farmers all started going belly up. And then what you had was a massive flight to the cities where thousands and thousands and thousands of destitute, broken, starving people had no choice but to compete for work in the abysmal factories for extremely low wages and an early death. Quite convenient, isn't it? When we were getting the Industrial Revolution going in Britain, they needed a lot of workers. They didn't have enough, so they repealed the Corn Laws, and all the farmers had to rush in and take up the jobs. It was a nightmare for the vast majority of British people, but it was also a free trader's paradise. And this is what you have with libertarians and anarchists, by the way. Don't look for any moral concern. I don't apply this to all of them. There's a lot of them who are libertarians and anarchists and out of ignorance here, but you'll talk to many of them and you'll find that if it's under the name of business, they have absolutely no morals. So your average anarchist who is now living in a shabby apartment, smoking pot, and hating the government, in those days would have gladly owned a factory and worked poor people to death for money. So always remember that while their economic strategies are being bandied about. America's economic glory days, the 1950s to the early 1960s, that's our economic glory days. This is the pinnacle of world civilization. For all of its ills, right? We understand that during that time period that there was a population of people here in the United States that didn't have equal rights. There's a lot of other bad things going on too. We were waging wars overseas. I'm talking about in terms of economics and living standards. The 1950s and early 1960s were the pinnacle of world civilization. The United States had the highest living standards. They had the highest wages. It was the only civilization that has ever had more middle-class people than any other class. There were more middle-class people than poor people in the United States during this time. But what destroyed it? Well, it was the systematic dismantling of tariffs that gradually reduced the American workforce over the ensuing decades before the giant sucking sound of NAFTA turned the job exodus up several notches. Indeed, we had the subsequent trade deals like CAFTA and the various bilateral agreements with China and other developing countries that exacerbated the problem even more, making NAFTA pale in comparison. So tariffs are a necessary part of a healthy national economy, and they have to be revived if anything resembling reasonable living standards are ever going to return to America. Trump's plan to place tariffs on products coming into the United States is a positive one, but it's also, we have to admit that it's too small to effectively revive the American economy by itself. With so many interweaving trade pacts that have been signed over the last 3 decades, a 20% tariff on goods coming in from Mexico might not necessarily bring jobs back to the U.S. In fact, it might only make these companies shift production from Mexico to some other South American sweatshop. The reality is that the Trump administration needs to implement a much larger tariff that's going to affect more countries than Mexico. We need an across-the-board tariff that applies to all imports, all of them, with the exception of goods that can't be produced adequately at home. 20% is a good starting point, and it could be adjusted up or down based on, depending on specific goods. But either way, the United States has to make it clear that it's going to be vastly more expensive for companies to produce items outside the country and ship it in than it is for them to produce the same material inside America's borders. These anti-protectionists always doth protest too much. They respond by arguing that producing goods in the United States are going to drive cost of those products up and actually make a bad situation worse for most Americans. And being completely honest, we have to admit that their fears are not completely without merit. Labor costs and regulations are higher in the U.S., for sure. That's part of the reasons that major corporations have been moving overseas for years. In other words, to take advantage of legalized rape and pillage of the environment and workers in less developed nations. For that reason, an argument for further globalization and free trade is essentially an argument supporting the exploitation of the poor and working class. So anybody, any Republican, any Democrat, any libertarian, any anarchist that tells you that tariffs are bad, they are arguing for the support of exploitation of poor and working people in the third world. You can hide that in political language, you can dress it up as anarchy, you can base it on the concept of freedom and choice, but you're still supporting exploitation. So the question of higher prices now, it's important to point out that the predictions of scorched fields and cities full of despondent shoppers hopelessly looking through storefront windows at plastic gadgets they just can't afford to buy anymore, that's just a scare tactic. Before the concept of free trade, we had a life before globalization, before free trade was forced down our throats despite the opposition of the American people. America produced its own goods in America, and everything was just fine. In fact, they were much better, economically speaking, than they are today. So we did it once. Why can't we do it again? Arguing that prices must go up is also disingenuous. Corporate boards and CEOs always have the option of making $8 million a year as opposed to $9 million. Of course, we have to be realistic, and we know that corporate fat cats in Wall Street, for them, making less is never an option. But this is precisely why tariffs are indispensable. That's the point of the tariff. Because if you leave it up to corporate fat cats, then you're just not going to ever get anywhere. So the imposition of protective tariffs has to be across the board. It needs to be accompanied by other policies also that are designed to raise the standard of living, like increasing the abysmally low minimum wage to that of a living wage. A nation full of minimum wage jobs is not the version of the American economy that anyone other than corporate overlords want to see. Americans need higher wages and greater skills, many of which have dissipated after nearly 3 decades of bouncing from one retail and service job to another. So the U.S. federal government, through a nationalized, or at least partially nationalized, Federal Reserve, offering credit stimulus and no-interest loans, has to begin retraining and preparing a new generation of Americans to get back to work and get the economy going again. This time in a more environmentally friendly manner with new technology and greater awareness of dangers posed to the environment and to animals and to human health. So the minimum wage must be raised. We're going to suggest $15 an hour over a period of years. America's economic glory years were built by a policy of high wages, high skills, and protectionism. Abandoning these policies was an act of foolishness by some and an act of treachery and treason by others. It is high time that we begin to reverse the policy of shipping American jobs overseas so that they can be manned by impoverished peasants. And decades of globalism and free trade have collapsed the Western world from within, America in particular, and it's wasted the lives of millions of people in the developing world. Let the corporations and bankers scream as loud as they want. Let the mainstream media and even the alternative media bitch and predict the end of the world, but free trade has had its time, and that time needs to end now. That's not going to be as popular in the alternative media. I'm going to have an article coming out on this soon if we can get an outlet to put it out. But we support the imposition of tariffs, but we want much more than this. I've only got 3 minutes left, and I can't even get to the Dakota Access Pipeline criticism. But notice also, I just want to mention this immigration issue, since we can go into this in just a few seconds. The immigration policies, the banning of refugees coming in from 7 Muslim countries. I'm not concerned in the least about Trump's ban on refugees coming from those 7 countries. Anybody who's labeling this as a Muslim ban, I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. That's typical skew tactics from the corporate media. It says nothing about a Muslim ban. It's not a Muslim ban. Syria is not a Muslim country, and it's secular. It doesn't specify only Muslims. My issue is the plan is why only 7 countries? We need a temporary ban on all refugees from entering the United States until we can get our own country back on track, until we can get illegal immigration solved here in this country. So I find it funny how these hypocritical protesters who are well-funded and well-trained, how they can run to airports and protest the ban on refugees when the root cause of the problem, which is America's bombs, its wars, and its imperialism in those countries, continues without a word, and continued for 8 years without a word. Were they protesting the war in Iraq? Were they protesting the war in Syria, or the war in Libya, or the war in Yemen, or the war in Afghanistan? No. As far as I'm concerned, these curious new protest movements have no legitimacy any more than the establishment itself. In fact, I'm suggesting that the two are actually one and the same. So a federal judge has now struck down the immigration ban. We encourage the Trump administration to rethink it, to just impose a ban on the refugee program across the board, not just for 7 countries. This has got to apply to us Saudi Arabians too. This has got to go to every single country in the world. We can't handle it right now, so impose a temporary ban on all refugees. But don't trust these protesters. These people were nowhere to be found for 8 years. Suddenly on day one they come out in mass droves. We've seen this many times before throughout history, and we know what this is. Don't trust them. They are not revolutionaries. They are not real activists. They're dupes and dupers, and we need to avoid them at all costs. They're not in it to stop wars. They're in it really to start one, and perhaps next week we can talk more about what these people are actually up to. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
Hey, this is JJ Inc., and when I'm on planet Earth, I listen to UCY.TV.